facilitate this event for you. I will be monitoring the chat, so if you need anything, feel free to send me a chat. I will be receiving chats as well as Kurt Sterling as our host. But just a few housekeeping items. You need to rename yourself to your first and last name. You can do that by hovering over your name, and you'll see a little blue icon that should give you an option to rename yourself in the participants section of Zoom. You also will, if your video becomes a distraction, I am going to be turning off your video. You will still be in the Zoom meeting to get the information that's being shared, but just so that you're not a distraction to others who are on the call. If you have any questions for our guest speaker, feel free to ask them in the chat box, and Kurt Sterling will be addressing those questions as they come through. He also has his own set of questions for Dr. Matthew Warren, our guest speaker. So without further ado, Kurt, you can go ahead and take it away.
Hi, thanks, Tamara. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Dr. Kurt Sterling. I'm currently a professor of microbiology here at West Hills College. I came to West Hills College back in the golden age of 2004. I was just finishing up my master's then. Like many community college students, I was a returning student as well. I've worn a number of hats and done a lot of things before I got into teaching. And I have the distinct privilege today of acting as moderator for this conversation with the young man who's going to speak with us today, Dr. Matthew Warren. Matthew came in. Matt, when did you start at West Hills?
2008.
Was it 2008? So
Yes,
I remember and that was, you were pretty quick out of high school, correct?
Yes, sir. It was right. Barely almost 2 months after high school, I actually started in your microbiology class, and that was when I learned I needed to change out of it.
Right. So I had Matthew in my micro class, and then I had him in phys, and then he came back to micro. And then Matthew enjoyed it so much, he actually ended up being my student worker for a whole year. Was it 2 semesters?
Yes,
and
sir.
That was a great opportunity. So I'm just, as my grandmother would say, I'm just pleased as punch to have Matt here today and to have this opportunity. So we've got a list of questions here that he's going to talk to you. But first and foremost, what I really want to hear the students, what I want the students to hear today is the fact that this is something that you're all capable of. So often when we are going through school, we think we have these grand plans. And I think, as Matt will be able to tell you, the path changes as you go. And so I'm going to have him start talking about that. But I want you all to think, what's my next goal after this? If I finish my associates, do I want to get my bachelor's? If I get my bachelor's, do I want to get my master's? So often we think that those degrees are for somebody else, when the fact of the matter is that's not true. You're all capable of doing that and moving forward with that. So Matt, the first question we have here is, can you tell us a little bit about your educational background and then how that is sort of where that has gone and where your career has gone because of that?
Wonderful. No, thank you for that question, Kurt, and welcome everyone so my educational background. So I am from Lemoore, California. I started at West Hills College, Lemoore in 2008, and I was very interested in biology, and that was my whole track, was targeting on associates in biology. And so I was at West Hills for 3 years, and then I completed my associates in science and biology, as well as a second associate's degree in associates in arts and liberal arts and math and sciences. And before I finished those degrees, I was actually I was always interested in the sciences. I loved being in the lab. I loved seeing how everything just worked. And so I always knew that I wanted to go for a bachelor's degree because I wanted to work in the lab. And originally I was interested in the avian sciences, so study of birds, because I've always been someone who fascinated by birds. And so that's what led me to targeting my baccalaureate institution, University of California, Davis. And so I transferred to UC Davis after graduating from West Hills, and I was in animal science with a specialization in avian sciences. And it was that's where I got my first hands into dipping into my research. My first found research was in avian immunology, so studying the immune system of birds. And that's also where I started getting my first glimpse into the world of nutrition. And so I had a really wonderful time at UC Davis, and I did complete my bachelor's degree. It wasn't easy, but I did complete my bachelor's degree. And before I completed my bachelor's degree, that was when I discovered I wanted to do something with my life, like really something big, because when I went to UC Davis, nothing could have prepared me for what really could have happened, which was learning how much when you go to a four-year university, including in Fresno State, you're going to be a small fish going into an ocean. And that's exactly what happened when I went to UC Davis. I was surrounded by Titan students who had some extraordinary experiences, and it was really cool learning some of their stories. And for me, one of the biggest things was when I was talking to professors, including even Kurt Sterling and Brian Abella at West Hills, those kinds of people really made a powerful impact on me, because they saw something in me. Even though I didn't think I was an extraordinary student, they saw something that made me realize that I could do something with my life. And so then, thanks to a lot of those wonderful people, especially the ones that helped supported me and made me realize I could do something, that's what made me realize I want to be a professor just like them someday. And to be a professor at a four-year university, you have to target a doctorate. So that meant I had to go for a PhD. And so I didn't know exactly what I had to do to get a PhD, but I wasn't going to stop. So right after I graduated with my bachelor's at UC Davis, I took a giant leap and I moved all the way to Auburn, Alabama to work on my master's degree in biological sciences. And it was there I had to go through an extraordinary shift, not just because I was going for a whole different region that I'm not used to, but I also had to shift fields because I was going to be working with people I've never even known. I didn't do any interviewing, but I loved it. It was extraordinary. Tailgating is no joke, by the way, in the Deep South. And from there, that led me to my next point, which was to go for my PhD. And so my PhD I did at North Carolina State University, and it was in nutrition. And so this really brings back some of the extraordinary aspects, because my PhD advisor was actually my undergraduate mentor from UC Davis's PhD students. So it really shows you the world is small in a sense, because I got to work with someone who was connected through me through my undergraduate institution. And they also did their undergraduate or did their PhD at UC Davis. And so now I'm currently a postdoctoral trainee. I'm actually funded by a National Institutes of Health training grant, in which my current position is a postdoctoral trainee at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And my goal here is basically to start really building my research impact and getting my work out there, but then to transition to a faculty position in the near future. And so that's my next step.
Awesome, thanks. I think, can you flesh that out a little bit? I don't know that all the students quite understand what's the purpose, of a postdoc. I mean, we're often described, as a postdoctoral researcher, but that's sort of a stepping stone. You've already touched on that. So what's the purpose of a postdoc, and what's the next step from there?
Wonderful. So what's the purpose of postdoc? So a postdoc is basically someone who completed their doctorate degree, and it's a position where it's a transition period. So basically what I'm going to be doing is there's different types of postdocs depending on what you want to transition into, but the whole goal is you're now learning to stand on your own 2 feet and establishing your own independence, in the sense that, let me use one example I was thinking about with regards to this. If someone was interested in doing research, there's actually different levels of research you could do, and it's actually tied to your educational training qualifications, because the more higher qualifications go, the more autonomy you can have with regards to how much you can really drive your own research. So if you can actually do, as Kurt mentioned earlier, I was actually a lab assistant in working for him and making the agar dishes. And so I was, for a better way to think about it, I was like the kitchen chef, just trying to prepare stuff, but I couldn't really ask my own questions then. So that's what led me to advancing my own education. And then when I was working on my higher level education, that's when I got to start asking my own questions and developing my own research ideas. And so now where I'm at today is, now I'm at the point where I'm trying to transition myself to eventually becoming the head of my own laboratory and driving my own research that can actually advance the world of knowledge that we know today. There may be a point where if students reading your basic textbook, you might read something that I would have actually developed and publish my work on. And so that's really where the postdoc really comes in, is to help me develop these skill sets to train me to ascend to the goal that I'm interested in next, which is to develop and can manage my own laboratory. Think of it like making you're making your own business. Does that answer your question, Kurt?
No, that's great. That you hit the nail on the head there. I think people will sort of get the idea what this is. So this for the students, a postdoc is always a stepping stone, as he mentioned. Now that you're done with your PhD, you know, you would think, yeah, I'm done with my PhD. I'm going to go straight. You know, I'm going to become a professor. You know, there's a lot of steps. Matt, how long is this particular postdoc? Because I know they're anywhere from 1 to 3 years. Is this one? How long is this particular postdoc you're in?
That's a wonderful question. So as you mentioned, yeah, postdocs could be 1 to 3 year positions, and they can actually go all the way up to 10 years if depending on the funding. So mine is actually renewed contractually up to 3 years. And during that time frame, one of my main goals is I am actually writing grant proposals to try to get more funding. And if I was to receive some of these if my grants were funded, that can actually allow me to prolong my own postdoctoral period so I could try to build up my own research foundation to help me become more competitive when I target a faculty position, as well as also have the research foundation to help me say, this is what I'm doing, this is what I could bring to your university, and this is where I can advance the field.
Awesome. So now that you're into this role as a postdoc, you know, what does a day look like for Dr. Matthew Warren? You get up on Monday morning, and you know, sort of walk us through the day. What does that look like for you?
That's a really good question. So yeah, I started my postdoc back in July 1st, actually. So it's really quite recent. And I'm going to first reflect more on my graduate level to give a bit perspective, but then I could transition to where my postdoc is. So when it comes to research, every day is actually really dependent on what you want it to be like, because there are some times where if you're running experiments, you're going to be in the lab, but then there are other days where you could probably be teaching or training somebody. There's the other days where you might just be going to meetings, and it's really just very dynamic. And so if you like fluidity, then research is actually going to provide you that perspective, because you're not going to be doing the same exact thing every day. Most people, when they think of research, you're just on a lab benchtop just running lab assays. That's actually not true, actually. I only spend when I was a grad student, I only spent like a few days every week in the lab, unless I was trying to push myself to getting some of the data ready for publication or for presenting. But otherwise, most of my time is really just planning. That's actually a really big foundation and skill set if you're interested in research, is really developing your planning skills, because it really comes down to what do you want. And if it is a little bit harder for you to get into that planning stage, then there are ways to help you develop it. But in terms of really broadening your own skill sets for careers, that is actually a really powerful skill that a lot of researchers could bring, even if they're not interested in academia, being professor. They could work with government, industry. There's so many different routes. And so, but I will at least mention at least one thing. When because I work with animals, I do work with live animals with my research for collecting data, and that's where I develop my research questions off of. I am actually at the animal schedule. And so when an experiment starts, when I need to monitor the animals, I'm on their time, not my time anymore. So if I have to go into the lab in midnight to go check my animals, I have to go in at midnight, because the animals are very important for my data. It can be tough, but it's really rewarding when you actually get some of the data. And so research itself is really very fluid and dynamic. But if you're someone that really does not like doing the same thing every day, research may be a career you're interested in, because I really don't do the same thing every day. Early this week, I was in meetings. Middle of this week, I went to the lab to go do some training. Today, more meetings. It's just, and the same next week, I have no idea. It just keeps changing, and I'm just adapting.
Awesome. So you've already mentioned a little bit about the skills that you need. What kinds of skills do you think, outside, along with academic skills, do you think that you got at West Hills that have applied as you've continued on through your education? You've already mentioned, alluding to things like organization and time management, which are huge. Are there others?
No, that's a wonderful question. So what can you really gain in terms of skills that can be really essential for this career or even beyond? And so one of them is communication, because when I'm actually planning out research experiments or trying to talk with colleagues, I have to constantly be talking with them about what my plans are. Like right now, I actually got emails from some of my lab group members because I got to go in next week to go get ready to check on some of the mice that we're working with. And so it's very important to have that communication, whether you're trying to plan an experiment, because not everyone could be working on the same experiment on bench tops. And so communication is extremely important with regards to research, as well as making sure that everyone knows where you're at. Another good skill that I remember learning from West Hills that really became very powerful for me is really the leadership skills that I gained, especially in my last years at West Hills. I actually became more involved with the Student Government Association, which I think is ASB now. And that becomes very important as a researcher because, as I stated earlier, someone is depending on you to get what you need to get done. And so you have to learn how to be responsible for your own work, as well as also making sure that you don't slow them behind in their work. And so you really learn how to become a leader of calling the shots. There were times when I ran lab experiments where I had two different teams, one team that was working on the same floor as me, another team was working on another floor. And I was just coordinating, okay, we have to get this sample over to here. We got to tell this person to get this sample over here. And it was very chaotic, but it was very exciting and thrilling to just try to see how everything works together like gears in a clock. And so those are two skills I can at least mention straight up. One last skill I will mention with regards that I learned from West Hills is really understanding that it's okay to make mistakes. That sounds like a weird skill to mention, but that is extremely important, especially as you go up higher in your education, that no one is perfect. Even if you think you're perfect, one of the things that you're gonna find out really quickly is we're all humans. And we all do make mistakes at one point or another. And I made plenty of mistakes, especially with my own research. I've made mistakes. And so when I was at West Hills, there were plenty of times where I made mistakes on some of my calculations, whether it was on the calculus classes or even I made mistakes on some of Kurt Sterling's exams. But it was okay because I learned how to understand those mistakes. And really understanding them is key to being a researcher, because the main facet of research is hypotheses, so an educated guess, and we basically are trying to test out hypotheses through experimentation. So I want to at least share one little quick thing on that detail. Most research never works out the way we want it to be, and I mean most. It's really rare for having something that works the way we want it. We can have everything set up the way we want it and the results do not match what we thought it would. That's why it's important to understand that mistakes happen, because that's what it's like, but you learn from it. I learned so much. When I was an undergraduate at UC Davis, I was running something called the bacteria killing assay, where I was ascertaining a bactericidal activity from plasma, from the blood, to try to see how effective was it at killing bacteria. And there was one time, and I measured this by looking at the colony forming units, the little colonies, the circles on the agar dishes on the plates, and counting them. And there was a point where they weren't growing. And I was like, what is going on? Because it worked one time, and I kept repeating this over and over to the point where I'm like, I have no idea what's going on. So I went to talk to my undergraduate mentor, and he asked me, he basically ran me through like what I was doing to try to figure out what could be going wrong. Troubleshooting, basically. And turns out I used the wrong media, the growth medium where the bacteria can grow in. So that's why they were not surviving. And so once that was solved, it worked like a charm. And so that's the key why I mentioned that it's okay to make mistakes, because that's key to becoming better at problem solving. And it's very important for research. So I think those are really wonderful skill sets that you can learn, and they will transcend even if you're not interested in the research career.
No, that's awesome. You know, you try and tell students, you know, this idea of, you know, they think, well, you go into research, you come up with a question, you do an experiment and it works. I want to reiterate what Matt said here, is the fact that if you design an experiment and it works exactly the way you thought, you have learned nothing. All you've done is affirmed what you already knew. I think, especially at the community college level, students don't realize that you learn more by failure than you ever learn by having something work exactly the way you want. Because when an experiment, and that experiment could be whether it be in the lab or how you're interacting with that person that you find attractive, you know, if that crashes and burns, it forces you to think about, you know, what did I do right? What did I do wrong? So thanks for that, Matt. I really appreciate that, because it illustrates a point that I try to make to my students often.
You're welcome.
So, I mean, I think we've talked about, you know, your biggest challenge. Well, are there other things that jump, you know, what are your biggest challenges that you face well, so let's talk about that. What are some of the challenges that you face as a postdoc where you are right now? And that could be, you know, the process of being a postdoc, or, you know, the organization, however you want to evaluate that.
No, that's actually a really, really good question. And yeah, there is definitely a few challenges I'm having to adapt to. And so one of the first ones I want to share is, even though we have a global pandemic going on right now and it's harder to work, that is its own challenge, but I'm ignoring that because you have to adapt to it. And so I've already adapted that. But one of the challenges I have to deal with is I'm in a whole new environment and I really don't know who I'm working with still. And I have yet to meet a lot of my colleagues because I've only talked to them through virtual Zoom, but it's a different story when you're actually interacting face to face and you can actually get a read on them. And I can't get that. I'm always reading through emails. And there are points where I'm like, I have no idea what they're doing. Are they scolding me? And it's really tough. And that's something I'm trying to adapt to, is trying to figure out how can I work with this? Because I have to work with these people, even if I may not like some of them. One thing that's really common in research is you're going to be working with all kinds of different personalities. It can be really exciting. It can be a bit challenging, but it's really something you really have to adapt to, is learning how to work with other people, because that's very important in any career you go. And so that's one of my biggest challenges, is really trying to connect with my peers, because it's just very different compared to when I was a graduate student and they can like walk me through things every day. Now I'm like trying to schedule, like, when can I go in and meet up with them, because there can only be so many people in the lab per day. And so it's been a bit more challenging in that sense. Another big challenge, I'm still trying to figure this out, and I'm working with my advisor on this, is the fact that if I feel like there's always a giant weight on my shoulders. I mean, I had that when I was finishing my PhD, but now it's starting to return again, because my funding source is coming from a federal agency. They want to make sure they get the results, that their money is being used properly. And so they really don't want to hear excuses. And I'm not trying to say I have excuses, but they want to make sure I'm producing something no matter what. And so I have this giant weight on my shoulders of trying to get work done. I actually had a meeting with my advisor yesterday, and I was talking to her about it, because I'm trying to take things slow because I'm trying to transition. But it turns out I'm just going to have to I hate to say this, roll with the punches and adapt to it, because it's going to be key. Because even though I'm within only 4 months of being a postdoc and I'm in a whole new environment, whole new set, everything is different. It's just, I have to just adapt. And that's the key, is I'm slowly adapting. It's going to be hard at first, but eventually, just like the latter half of my PhD, it actually becomes like a downhill slope of a roller coaster. It just starts producing on its own, because you learn how things work and it becomes easier. So this early hump, and I've heard this from my colleague postdocs, is the first year is really tough, because you have to learn how do you adapt to things. And I'm still trying to adapt. So it's going to be a very big challenge. I have not lost much hair yet, thankfully. So that's my measurement of how much stress I have, is how much hair I'm losing. So it's working out well, at least.
No, I think you bring up a really good point there. I know this was true for me as well when I was going through, and you can apply this to anything. You know, when you take on some new task, you tend to see it as this massive hill in front of you. Where you're like, I am never going to be able to overcome this, because all you see is the very top of the mountain, that's your goal up there. And when you're standing there and looking at it, you're like, I can never get up there. That's too steep. It's too far away. And what you'll realize is that it's a process of, let's go with that mountain analogy. If you stand here in the valley and you look at the top of the peaks up in the Sierra Nevada, you're like, wow, those mountains are way up high. And as you start to drive up, you know, you go through Oakhurst and you're like, okay, well, I realize I'm getting higher, but it doesn't feel like you're going, you know, up a mountain all at once. It's it's a process, and you're going to hit plateaus, and things are going to go well, and you're going to, hit a couple of valleys, and you're, sometimes those valleys are, hey, this is really nice, I'm cruising, and other times you're like, oh, this is going to end very badly, and you have to find another trail out. So,
if you don't mind, I wanted to at least bring one point up, Kurt,
sure.
if you don't mind me interrupting. So yeah, with regards to challenges are, I loved how my undergraduate mentor phrased that for me. One of the reasons why he took me in, and I'm just going to toot his horn because he was a wonderful person. My undergraduate mentor, if you ever buy bird food, he most likely formulated diets. He's world renowned when it comes to avian nutrition. And I did not know that when I first joined his lab, but he was an extraordinary person. But one thing he told me why he took me into his lab, because he doesn't take undergraduates from what I was told, was because I spent a month pestering him, and you could thank Kurt Sterling because he was the one that recommended me, don't stop pestering them if you know someone. So that was wonderful advice. But the reason why he really enjoyed me as an undergraduate was because when I had a barrier in front of me, I go around it, I break through it, I go under it, I go over it. I did whatever it took to overcome it. And that's the key when I think about challenges. Challenges aren't placed in front of us, not to prevent us from achieving what we want, but to help us recognize our own potential and overcoming them. And that's something that's actually one of my big philosophies that I teach to my mentees or even students when I teach, is recognizing your true potential, because we don't realize how much we are capable of doing unless we try. And even with a lot of challenges, we get better at figuring out how to solve them.
Yeah, problem solving skills is definitely one of those things that you learn as you go. You've all done that as a student. You sort of get to this point where you're like, you got two options. You can throw up your hands and walk away, or you can say, I'm going to keep going, right? What we want you to learn, what we as professors want you to learn, is how to keep going, to not say, okay, this is something I can't, instead of looking at that mountain and thinking I can't get up there, is take a step back and look and go, okay, is there an alternate path? How do I get around this? Not I can't, but how do I do this? So Matt, what do you, even though you've been in this job since all of July, well then, yeah, let's talk about this real quick. So what do you enjoy and what do you dislike about being a postdoc?
Oh, that's a really good question. So the one thing I really enjoy, and this is just phenomenal, I love it, is knowing there are other people who are just like me. And I'm not speaking in terms of my ethnicity, I'm talking solely about people who are other postdocs, because the reason why is because we have all achieved it, and it's really fun when we all talk about how we've got here, because we all hold PhDs, but we all have our own goals, and it's really fun to interact with all these wonderful people and really hearing our stories of how we've overcome adversities to achieve where we're at today, because we keep trying to pump each other up, hype each other up, that we could do whatever we can at this point because we earned it. And so that is one of the biggest things that's been very important for me as a postdoc, even my short time, is having a really supportive network of colleagues that can I hang a shoulder on, because they really make my time here really positive. Even though I have not met any of them in person yet, it has been truly, I look forward to whenever we have our bi-monthly chats, actually every 2 weeks. We had it last night, and last week, I'll share this because it's really fun, I actually was a co-MC with another one of the postdocs at our research symposium, where we were trying to showcase all of the postdocs at our university, their research. And the whole fun part about it was I was always talking to the audience, like in Zoom, like what we have right now, and just really trying to, the resonance of how everyone's trying to support each other. Like, it's okay, we got this. It's a really positive feedback mechanism in which the more you feed upon it, the more positive you feel. And it was fun. And so that's one of the big things I love about being a postdoc. What do I not like about being a postdoc is really, I have no idea what I'm doing half the time. And that sounds really weird, but that is apparently a pretty common thing, because as I stated, I'm trying to learn how to establish myself as a scientist who could stand on my own 2 feet. And there is no perfect way that can happen. And I have published my work, but then there are others who publish a lot of work. I don't compare myself to them. That's not relevant. But the key is I have no idea what I need to do exactly sometimes to achieve what I want. And it's really murky, actually. But that's what makes it exciting, because if I could, all I have to do is keep succeeding in the way I'm going. And then eventually there's gonna be a point where I have to just reinvent it all over again, but not as a postdoc, but as a professor. And so these challenges of me not knowing what I'm doing half the time are just ways that I can positively look at myself, that if I can figure out how to manage this, this will be important for when I achieve the job I've been targeting my entire career.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much for sharing that and being so candid, because it's one of those, you know, you're going through that phase, and I think we all do that. And Mrs. Babb and Tamara can talk to that as well. You know, we've all transitioned careers, you know, we've all sort of moved from one place to another, and that transitional time is always the hardest time. As you've mentioned, it's really hard, and it's one thing to move, you know, to stay in the town that you're in and get a new job. It's another thing, you know, to move to a whole new city, and sometimes that's what you have to do. I remember when I was a graduate student talking about being a postdoc. You know, if you wanted to be a postdoc, you pretty much had to be willing to go wherever the work was. You know, you've got to be willing to make those changes. So I'd like to change the vernacular here a little bit for the students to realize that, you know, this postdoc is a step for Matt, who's looking to become a professor, right? He's looking to move into the role at a 4-year institution where he's not only an instructor and a teacher, but also a researcher conducting his own work. So Matt, if you could share with the students what kinds of experiences, and let me, Tamara, if I'm correct here, pretty much everyone, this is, not all of us are in here are STEM students, correct? But I know a number of you are. If you shake your head if you're a STEM or engineering, physics, math, a couple folks I recognize. Okay, so in the STEM field, the experiences that you're going to need moving forward, Matt, what kinds of experiences would you tell students to investigate if they were interested in multiple advanced degrees?
That's a really good question. And the one thing I will at least preface before I really answer this question is it's okay if you don't know what you're going to be doing. Actually, I did not know. Originally, I thought I was going to be a marine biologist working with whales. I am nowhere near the ocean, and I am nowhere near marine biology. And so I didn't even think I was going to be even background in nutrition. I only took one basic nutrition class at WHCL. So it's really exciting to actually know that a majority of my research is with nutrition. And so you really wouldn't know what advanced degrees you're going to focus on. And so, but now I'm going to shift in terms of what experiences can you have that can really allow you to ascend. And the most exciting part, and this isn't even just applicable to STEM students, is it's not really about, you're taking a lot of courses, especially at WHCL, and some of you are probably wondering, why are you taking this class? And it probably seems like, why? And it's not easy to recognize it, but once you really get into your upper division courses, that's when it becomes more apparent. Let me use 2 examples because I love to use these 2 examples. So for anyone who has actually made it to, I shouldn't say made it, but has taken calculus at WHCL, you know about differential equations, the rate of change over time, exponential growth and decay. Where are you going to use that? You can use that in the world. I use those actually. I do work with differential equations, even though I do not like math. I love statistics, I just don't like mathematics. But I use them. And so what do I use it with? I use it with something that Kurt teaches in his microbiology class called an ELISA, enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. And so this is going to be a real-world experience to really give you a perspective on how your coursework, what you learn now, could really show up in the future. So what does an ELISA do? So an ELISA is a way to measure antibody titers, to measure what kind of proteins are you trying to, your body's trying to react against for an immune response. So one good example of an ELISA that many people may not recognize is pregnancy tests. They're actually an ELISA that could detect for a specific hormone that's only expressed when a woman is pregnant. And so why would an ELISA be important with regards to calculus? So how we measure this, especially when we think about the pandemic with COVID-19 and measuring if someone has been positive for COVID-19, is we're actually trying to measure for that curve of the increasing antibody concentration. And so what happens is when you have that increase, when it skyrockets to a very high level, you really can't read it on a graph sometimes. So what do we do to make it easier to read? We convert it to a log function. That way it's easier to graph, so it becomes a straight line. And that can help you determine over the rate of time, has someone been infected by COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 virus? And that is the key. That is just one example that you could learn from some of your coursework from just calculus or even microbiology at West Hills that will be valuable for the future, because I use those for answering questions in my current research. And so a lot of that coursework that you're doing now really does have application. It's just hard to see it because you just aren't able to apply it yet. And so that's one really good example. One other example I will think about, or at least I will talk a little bit about, is with regards to experiences, is really learning how to navigate the system. And that sounds kind of odd to say that, because we all think we know how to navigate, like we go to classes and then we just go back to our apartment or homes to just rest or study. But I would highly recommend that don't just focus on just studying for classes. I mean, it's important to get the good grades, but learn how to navigate in terms of what kind of resources are available for you at your college or even university when you transfer, because there are a lot of wealth of resources at every level that help you navigate things. So when I'll share one crazy story. So when I was in my final year of my PhD, right before my final year started, PhD students actually have like an advisor that helps guide them at their research. And they're very important for their success, or if they have to go through a little bit more challenges. So I actually was really good connections with my PhD advisor, but she had to leave her position. She resigned, and I had to finish my final year of my PhD without my advisor. She was still my chair for my whole advising, but I had to stand on my own 2 feet. And I had to navigate the system without her help. Not that she wasn't there to help me, she just could not help me the way she could have anymore. And so what did I do? I contacted the graduate school. I contacted my graduate program officer. They gave me the resources to figure out how do I navigate the system to succeed. When my final defense, so when you're basically going up to your final thing you have to do when you're a graduate student for a master's in science or arts, whatever, or even a PhD, you have to do something called a defense, where you have to defend your research. When I went up right before my defense occurred back in March, that was when COVID-19 hit North Carolina and they started closing the university. And it was scary because not just because of the COVID-19, but because it was going to put everything I had planned with my defense in jeopardy. And it is not easy to set up a defense because you have to get a lot of people in the same room on the same time. And it was just chaos. And so my resources, knowing that I had people out there to support me, I contacted my graduate program officer. She contacted the dean of the graduate school. That dean gave me permission to do my defense in person the way I had it planned, just to help reduce the stress I would have to deal with. So when I gave my PhD defense, I did it in person, but also on Zoom for those who could not come in person. But it's because I knew about those resources. They helped me succeed. And it's something that's been very valuable for me throughout my entire education, not just my PhD. Even at West Hills, I went to the advising offices to have them help me with navigating my coursework. Like, what do I need to do so I could properly transfer to UC Davis? So those are 2 types of experience I want to mention. Is your coursework does matter. Even if you don't think it's going to matter, it will matter eventually. And then knowing what kind of resources you have.
So Matt, if I can piggyback onto that, one of the questions that's come up is, what kind of would you recommend to students, specifically here at places like West Hills, things like work experience, like either internships, job shadowing, volunteering opportunities? Did you have any of those? Did you take advantage of those? I mean, I know the answer to at least part of that, but could you talk a little bit about that with the students?
No, that's actually an extraordinary good question, actually. So what I recommend, if you had the chance to get some real world experience working on a job, whether it's shadowing, internship, I highly encourage you to do that, because it's not really about if that's going to be your career or not. It's about knowing, is this the right fit for you? Because we don't know what kind of jobs we're getting ourselves into. We can hear about the glamours of oh, this person's a scientist. If they work in the pharmaceutical world, they can make a lot of money. But unless you really know what kind of work they really do in hand, they actually spend a lot of their time rerunning the same lab experiments to try to find one tiny little result. And they could spend all night, and I mean overnighters. I'm pretty sure Kurt remembers maybe when he worked overnight in the labs, because I sure do, when we're trying to get that one result that we need. And so that's where the value of internships or even job shadowing helps you, is knowing what kind of job are you really getting yourself into. And so one of my mentees is actually she's a vet student up in Tufts University over in Boston, Massachusetts, and really wonderful student. She was one of my students when I was at Auburn, and she was really phenomenal when I was teaching human anatomy and physiology, similar to human anatomy and physiology taught at West Hills, actually. So that was really fun. But I remember she asked me about what it took to be just like me, or at least to get to where I was at, since I was a graduate student. And I told her, keep doing what you're doing, because she was involved with shadowing all of these veterinarians in Alabama. And why was that important? Because she figured out what type of vet she was interested in doing versus what she was not interested in doing. Because you may hear about a scientist, but the world of science is phenomenally gigantic, and it's almost the size of the universe, most likely, because of all the different careers we can actually get ourselves into. The only way we can really know what we're getting ourselves into is to actually see it. So if you have a chance to get an internship, even if it's unpaid, that's valuable. One internship I did when I was at UC Davis was I was actually working with dairy cattle up in UC Davis. What was I doing? Animal behavior. I was helping move these dairy cows to pens so that they can measure heat stress with sprinklers, which they actually do in Tulare County. And does it mean I want to be an animal behavior? No, I don't think I could. I mean, I love dairy cows. They're fun to work with, but I don't think I could work with animal behavior research, because you're just basically sitting there and watching an animal move. I mean, I'm not giving it justice, but that's just the way I see it. So, but that was the important part that internship gave me. And so they really do have a lot of value. If you have the chance to get that real world experience, take advantage of it, because you may find out this may be what you're looking for, or you know what, this isn't what I'm looking for. Let's see if there's another option, because the coolest part about any field, not just even in the STEM, is there's many jobs. If for some reason trying to target the research position I'm targeting doesn't work out, I'm interested in just being a teacher. I love teaching. And I can see myself doing that. And if for some reason I can't do teaching, then I want to do something with admissions and trying to work with diversity committees at universities to help recruit students, because, you know, I love doing that. I love working with people, trying to figure out how can we help enrich everyone's lives. So take advantage of those opportunities you got, because you never know where they could lead you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much for that, Matt. I'd like to say that I told Matt what to say, because his experience is very parallel to mine. I remember when I was an undergraduate and I was a returning student. I had gone off and might have failed out of school once before I went back. But that ties into that, you never know where you're going to go. But I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I loved science. And so the recommendation actually of my dad, who's not in science at all, he's like, go talk to your professors, see if you can work in one of their labs. And sure enough, I had a professor that I really enjoyed his class, and I went to say, hey, can I work in your lab? I didn't even know what that meant. And he's like, sure, I'm taking students right now. So I went and worked in his lab, and I was working with proteins. And I spent a semester in there, and I'm like, hey, Dr. Sukamura, thank you very much for this opportunity. Bye. And then I found another professor who ended up being my advisor for my master's degree. And the project that she gave me to work on ended up being my master's project. But that's a great opportunity. You have to be willing to just go up to your professors and say, you got something I can do in your class? You'd be amazed what you've learned. First of all, most often they're going to say, sure. Because you just think, oh, no. Who are you? Why would I want you to help? They'd love it for you to go talk to them. So those are great opportunities. Matt, I'd like to turn this in another direction and sort of step outside of what you do professionally. But there was a great question that came up is, how do you balance your work life? What is your work-life balance do? Do you find downtime? and what kinds of things do you like to do, you know, that you find de-stressing for you?
No, that's actually a really good question. And I don't think it's asked enough, especially for those who are in the higher education and graduate school, especially, is work-life balance. And so what do I do to balance my life? And so yeah, I'll at least start off with how I de-stress. So how I de-stress, and Kurt knows me really well, I love to play video games, and I still play video games. World of Warcraft was a game I played a lot throughout my entire college days. I don't play on as much as I used to anymore because I have a real life where I kind of commit more time to my research, but it was something that really allowed me to get away from all the work I did. And those kinds of things are really important to your success, not just as a student, but for your entire well-being. And so for me, especially when I was an undergraduate, I mean, yes, I spent days when I was in the lab and even days when I was in studying, but there were times where I always would just get away from everything and just play video games. And if I wasn't playing video games, then I would probably be hanging out with friends, because one thing I will share, and this is something really personal to me, when I was back in West Hills, even before West Hills, I was actually very introverted and very shy. I didn't want to interact with anyone. And it wasn't until I got to UC Davis when I forced myself. I really had to push myself. I wanted to change. Because I was told that I have the capabilities of really being a person that could stand out for just being me. And that's exactly what I did. I started putting myself out there and really I went from being an introverted person to an extroverted person, and it resonated with people. People really enjoyed who I was, because most people think if you're in the sciences, you're a geek or a nerd. That doesn't matter. I am a geek, and I'm proud of it, actually. And it's fun because I get to be myself, and it's really exciting even when I'm hanging out with colleagues, we could just geek about science all the way until like early in the morning. It's just fun to just talk about science. But otherwise, that's our way of distressing. When I was a graduate student at Auburn, what a lot of my peers and I did after we were done teaching for the week, we went to one of the bars. I don't drink, actually, which is ironic, but I always loved hanging out with my peers because what would we do? We would talk trash about our students, about how they always made mistakes or something. It sounds kind of harsh, but that was our way of really distressing. And it was fun because we all were there to help each other. And so that was something that I really enjoy. And that's actually something I do to like separate my professional life from my personal life, because it's really important. It's a really wonderful question, because one thing I do now, and this is something I made myself do as a graduate student at NC State, is Saturdays. Saturdays are Matthew Warren days. That's a day where I don't do any work unless there was something very big I planned, but it's my day to just be me. And it's very important for my well-being and recharging before I get ready for the barrage of what's going to happen the following week. And it's something that's been really important for me. And so that's something some people may want to consider, is maybe just having a personal day where it's just you, and enjoy it. Be proud of it, because you know why? A lot of us aren't really taking care of who we are. And it's okay to just take a day for yourself, because you know why? Because we're all extraordinary people. And so we all deserve that kind of fashion in some sense. So those are some of the things I do in terms of separating myself from my work life, is really knowing I don't take home my work. Now, I will at least share one last thing. I do work a lot in the evenings. Why? Because as a scientist, as a researcher, we spend a lot of time writing. And this is kind of a weird tangent, but a lot of research really revolves around writing. And Kurt probably knows this because we have to write dissertations. So, and this is for every field, not just if you're interested in research. Focus on your writing skills. It's not easy. I struggle at it too. But if you can get better at it, it's very therapeutic when you figure out how you want to narrate what you want. So that's how, hopefully that answers your question, because that's a really good question on how I manage my work-life balance.
No, that's awesome. Thank you very much for that, Matt. I really appreciate that, your honesty. Yeah, that was something Matt and I had in common way back then, was actually video games, and I still have been known that might be my guilty pleasure from time to time. So there was a question that came in, and it wants to sort of jump back to what you had talked about. We had asked you about, interning and job shadowing and volunteering. And this is a great question. It's going to make Mrs. Warren very, very happy. So how did you find those opportunities, Matt, to do things like interning and volunteering? That was one of the questions that came in.
That's a really, really good question. How do you find these opportunities? And that's really what it is. You have to find them. It sounds very simple, but they're not going to come to you actually. You have to go out there and find them. So let me at least give a few examples of some of the opportunities I got. So let's start off with my time at UC Davis. I already mentioned how Kurt and Brian Abella mentioned to me, you got to pester someone. That's exactly what I pestered the guy for a whole month. And I mean, once a week, every week, saying, is there anything I could do with your lab? Is there anything I could do with your lab? I didn't have anything, no experience. I was just, this is someone I want to work with. And eventually he allowed me to. And that became a big deal of my entire undergraduate research career, was that opportunity, because I did not give up on that persistence. That's just one opportunity I did. Now, I want to share this big one because this one might really be surprising, but it's really important. I want to share to everyone because Kurt mentioned how there were some times where he didn't do so stellar in school. I'm the same way too, actually. So when I was at UC Davis, you could see me, I have a doctorate. I was not some 3.0 student. I never had a cumulative GPA of 3.0 at UC Davis, actually. It may sound weird, but my GPA was a 2.78 when I graduated. And I'm proud of that. I wouldn't say anyone should try to get it because you need a higher GPA to make it easier for you, but that was who I was. And I didn't know that sooner because I had a lot of other things going on. But the reason why that becomes relevant is because when I started applying to graduate schools, you have to do there's a whole application, and applications are very big compared to applying for a undergraduate institution. And I won't say too much of the details, but if you want to contact me in the future, especially when you're thinking about it, I'm more than happy to talk about it because I'm actually guiding one of my mentees through the graduate application process right now. Is you have to have a good GPA because they use the GPAs to help determine, can this person really succeed at the graduate school level? The other thing, this is starting to change, but it is something you have to be aware of because it's not changed completely, is you may have to submit your graduate readiness examination, the GRE scores. There's a lot of, yes, and Eric's face, because I didn't do so hot on that either. But yeah, those are two big things that schools will look at. And the GRE is going to be different, but I can't really attest to that at the moment. But my grades were not exactly the most stellar, neither were my GRE scores. So when I started submitting my applications, I still remember when I got rejection letters from graduate schools, from Iowa State University, which was my top choice, Kansas State, which I considered my backup choice, UC Davis, which I thought should be fine because I went there, rejection letters. And the last one, and the one I went to, was Auburn. And I submitted that one a little bit later because they had a later deadline period. And what happened was I emailed the professor who I was interested in working with. She's a wonderful mentor of mine. Her name is Wendy Hood, one of the most extraordinary people I've known. She's actually from California too. And I remember just emailing her saying that I was interested in doing some work with her. She works with maternal effects, so she works with mothers in the animal form actually. And I was interested in working with her, and she asked me she wanted to see my GRE and GPA. And when she saw that, I'll never forget it because it's one of the most biggest things in my life. And it's nothing against her in any way. I use it now as a positive motivation for myself. There was a long list in that email she sent me, but the line that stood out the most was, I don't think you're going to be getting into graduate school. And that was something I'll never forget, actually, because it was like, what was the point of all this research if I was never going to succeed going on? And so I was under a little bit of stress. I was a little bit depressed, but I moved on from it. A few weeks later, I get an email from Wendy saying about how she was at a conference in Texas and she saw my undergraduate mentor. He was the key to this. He spoke extremely highly of me, that don't worry about his grades. They don't mean anything. He is an extraordinary person. He convinced her to giving me a shot. She sent me an email saying how he spoke so highly of me that she was willing to support and do whatever it takes to get me to get into grad school at Auburn. 5 months later, I got accepted to Auburn as a master's in biological sciences at Auburn University. And a month after I arrived at Auburn, my master's advisor, one of my best friends, she got to see what kind of person. Those grades and the GR scores really did not mean anything about what I was capable of. And she really enjoyed me as a student. So that opportunity came because I knew someone who was willing to put their own reputation on the line to support me. That's how powerful it is to have a network. And some of those opportunities really come from the network. So at least I know I've droned on, but I want to at least share one last thing, Kurt, if you don't mind, because this relates to my current position. So how I came across my postdoc position is normally when you look for postdocs, your advisor helps you finding those. I did not have any of that. I had to find it on my own because it was not my advisor. She works with industry, but she knew I was trying to transition away from working with poultry. So she could not really help me. I had to put myself out there. And I do remember sending emails. It was last August, actually, August 2019. I started sending emails to professors, spending late nights, just looking at different university websites, trying to find people who would be interesting for me to work with. I got no responses. There was one that was pretty harsh and made me recognize I had imposter syndrome, but I was proud of it afterwards. But then when I emailed my current advisor I work with, she saw the potential in me. And she replied back that email to me, and she was doing whatever it takes to get me here. 6 months later, after we first corresponded, I got the interview chance. I don't know what I did at that interview, but it was enough to get me the position. And so those opportunities, you have to learn how to go out and put yourself out there. It's not easy, and I know it firsthand. Kurt might know it too, but when you go out there, they are waiting for you, actually. So do whatever it takes to get them.
Oh, thank you very much. You've illustrated a number of points there. Thank you. There's another question that says, how did you decide on UC Davis? Did you have to change anything? If I can just real quickly close that up for Matt, he'd spend a lot of time working on that. And you've kind of reached that point because a lot of times when you come out of high school and you go to college, if you haven't been raised in a family that's sort of, told you, you're going to go to Boston and you're going to go to Harvard or whatever, we kind of do what's close because it's convenient. The community college system is excellent for that. But you're coming out of the community college now. What's the next step? Sometimes Fresno State is a great step. It was a great step for me, but for other folks, Fresno State may not have the program that you're looking for, and you've got to take ownership of that and say, okay, I'm going to start doing a little bit of legwork on your own, to figure out how it is I'm going to go to that next place. And the last part I hope you've all caught this from Matt, is the fact that get to know your professors, not just sitting there. I know as a professor, there's students who come through my class, and at the end of the year, I probably would have a hard time coming up with their name, because I didn't engage with them maybe as much as I would like. But you've got to be willing to say, hey, you know what? I want to talk to that professor, especially if they're teaching something that you think is interesting. Because as Matt mentioned, I have to wave the same flag Matt did. My undergrad scores, when I went to apply for grad school, I was like, and I was someone who finished my master's, and then I had 15 years before I went back to do my dissertation. I had to go look at my undergraduate scores. It was like, how the heck did I graduate? But undergraduate school is very different from grad school. It's a great experience if you want to do that. But you have to get to know your professors because they're going to be an opportunity to help you with that. Then one of the other questions that was, how do you find these experiences for volunteering and job shadowing? And, Matt said, you're going to have to just do the legwork and figure it out. One of the ways you can do that is the lady that's sitting immediately to my left here is you guys have the WIN Center, right? We have this opportunity at West Hills with people like with Miss Warren and Miss Babb. We have a lot of opportunities, so go talk to them. They can help you find those experiences. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. I have really appreciated connecting with you again. We'll chat a little bit more off link here. I'm going to turn it back over to Mrs. Warren, and she's going to close us down. But thank you all for coming, and thank you all for sticking around and hearing what Matt has to offer for you. Thanks, Matt. We appreciate your being here today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you, Dr. Sterling, for just facilitating this. And in the chat, I'm going to be posting a survey link for you guys to fill out. And that's just to make sure that any events that we do, they are beneficial and useful for you. So please complete this survey link as it just helps us determine what future events to do so that we make sure that they're useful for you guys. So with that, everything is good to go. I really appreciate you guys attending. I hope this BizChat was informational for you guys. And thank you again, Dr. Matt Warren and Dr. Kurt Sterling for doing this for us. We appreciate it. Okay.
My
Bye,
pleasure.
guys.
See ya. Matt, go ahead and stick around if you want for a minute.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to. I was gonna tell Tamara that she could have put my email down if